The rules of Morden Estate were not written down anywhere, they did not need to be, they lived in the way the senior footman cleared his throat when a new kitchen girl reached for the wrong door. They lived in the half-second pause before Hugo Crew, head gamekeeper, finished a sentence that told you, with perfect clarity, that you had already made a mistake and had not yet been informed of it. They lived in the cold, which was not the cold of the season but the cold of the stone itself. 300-year-old limestone that had absorbed so many winters it no longer bothered to warm up in summer. The rule that mattered most was never spoken at all. Do not go near the Hound, not the hounds, the pack that lived in the East Kennels. Manageable creatures with muddy paws and a professional interest in rabbits. Those you could pass without incident. The rule was about one animal specifically, the old dog that slept on a particular flagstone in the rear courtyard. A grey-muzzled bloodhound of extraordinary size and thoroughly disagreeable temperament, whose name was Thunder and who had, in 3 years of the new Duke's tenure, put one stable boy's forearm in a sling, driven a visiting gamekeeper from Derbyshire directly back to Derbyshire, and regarded every living person on the estate with the settled contempt of a retired magistrate. Everyone knew Thunder obeyed one person. The Duke said so himself. He answers to me, His Grace had said, on the occasion of the Derbyshire incident, in the flat, unhurried voice he used for matters he considered already settled. Anyone else who approaches him does so at their own risk. I have said this before. I should not need to say it again. He had not needed to say it again. The staff of Morden had excellent memories for statements delivered in that particular tone. Maeve had arrived at Morden on a Tuesday in late November, in the back of a cart that smelled of turnips. With one boot, the other boot had been on her foot when she had fallen asleep somewhere north of Harrogate. It had not been on her foot when she woke. The girl sitting across from her, pink-cheeked, deliberately occupied with looking out the other side of the cart, had feet that were, Maeve noted, somewhat wider than usual. Maeve had looked at the boot, and at the girl's feet, and had made the calculation that starting an argument 20 minutes from her new place of employment was a poor investment. She had arrived at Morden with one boot. And the cold flagstone of the rear courtyard had introduced itself to her left foot with brisk thoroughness. Hugo Crew had lined up the new arrivals in that courtyard. He was a tall man, not yet 50. With the kind of weathered face that implied a life spent outdoors making unpleasant decisions about animals. His eyes were a pale, assessment-colored gray. They moved down the line of new staff with the efficiency of a man pricing livestock. The East Kennels are your concern if Mr. Aldridge assigns you there, he said. The rear courtyard is not. If you are crossing the courtyard, you cross it. You do not stop. You do not look at the dog. You do not, under any circumstances, make sounds at it. Clicking, whistling, calling. His gaze paused, almost imperceptibly, on nothing in particular, on the middle distance. On some private thought, any of that. You leave it alone. The Duke has made his wishes clear on this matter. Maeve stood at the end of the line. She was small for her age, which was 19. And she had the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistook for stupidity and sometimes for insolence, and which was, in fact, neither. Her hair was dark red, the color of old brick. And it was scraped back with the decisive severity of a person who had long ago stopped considering it an asset. Her hands were already chapped from the cold. Her left foot was numb. She heard everything Hugo Crew said. She also heard what he did not say. Which was that the dog on the flagstone, the enormous grey-muzzled hound who had not moved throughout the entirety of this address, was watching her, not the line. She did not look back. She had learned. From the old knowledge that lived in her hands and her throat and the particular set of her shoulders. That you did not meet a dog's eyes when it was deciding what it thought of you. You let it think. You gave it time. You breathed normally and kept your hands loose and waited for it to make up its own mind. She breathed normally, she kept her hands loose, and then, because she had not expected it and had no defenses prepared against it because it came from somewhere older than her fear and quicker than her judgment, she felt the shape rise in her chest, the shape of a sound, a specific sound. A column of air configured in a way she had not configured it in 6 years. Her lips began to form the opening position without her permission. She pressed them shut, her right hand found the pocket sewn into the inside fold of her apron, the deep one. The one she had added herself with 3 nights' worth of stolen candle and a bone needle, and her fingers closed around the small weight at the bottom. Smooth. Cool. The length of her middle finger. Don't. She stood very still. Hugo Crew dismissed them, the line dispersed. The other new arrivals filed toward the servants' entrance, rubbing their arms against the cold, exchanging low murmurs. Maeve followed. As she crossed the rear courtyard, she felt the hound's attention track her like a slow tide. She did not look back. She walked through the door and into the dim warmth of the back passage and told herself it had not happened. None of it. The dog had been watching a bird. A shadow. The cold played tricks. Her fingers stayed wrapped around the bone whistle for a long time after that. The Duke of Morden had, in his 31 years, developed a reliable method for avoiding the things he did not wish to examine. That he worked with the methodical, slightly punitive thoroughness of a man who has discovered that thought, left unoccupied, tends to migrate toward subjects he has not given it permission to visit. He was up before the household. He reviewed accounts that did not require reviewing. He corresponded with his land agents with a regularity they found both admirable and faintly alarming. He rode the estate's perimeter in WEAT. That sent his grooms to find plausible excuses to remain indoors, and in the evenings, when work ran out, he went to Thunder. This was not sentiment. He would have rejected the word with the quiet force he brought to rejecting most things. It was simply that the old hound was the only living creature on the estate that did not want anything from him. The dog did not want reassurance or approval or careful management. It wanted to walk, and to be left alone between walks, and occasionally to have the place behind its ears attended to. These were transactions Nicholas understood. He was comfortable with them. His father had trained Thunder. His father had trained all the hounds. Though Thunder had been the last and the finest a gift to himself, the old Duke had written in one of his journals, against the coming winter. Nicholas had found that entry 2 years ago, in the weeks after the funeral, and had not been able to determine whether it was funny or unbearable, and had settled on leaving it alone. That he had kept Thunder. He had kept the journals. He had kept the estate and the title and the weight of both, and he had set his shoulder against all of it and pushed. And it had mostly worked. Mostly. Sir Edmund Hartley arrived on a Thursday, with his son and his son's friend, and a professed enthusiasm for seeing the northern moors that Nicholas suspected was cover for Sir Edmund's actual enthusiasm, which was for the potential of a business arrangement involving several parcels of land on Morden's eastern boundary. Nicholas received them with correct hospitality. He showed them the grounds. He listened to a long monologue about drainage. It was on the second day of this visit. During a tour of the shooting grounds, that it happened. The party was moving along the north side of the rear courtyard, Hugo leading, explaining the layout of the game coverts with his usual proprietorial fluency. Sir Edmund asking questions that circled methodically toward the eastern parcels. Nicholas walked slightly apart from the group, as he generally did, with Thunder on a long lead at his left side. That he noticed the girl because Thunder noticed her first. The hound had been walking with its usual gait, the slow, slightly arthritic progress of an old dog that has decided it will set its own pace and the rest of the world may accommodate itself accordingly. Then something changed. A quality of attention entered the animal's bearing that Nicholas had not seen directed at anything but him, not aggression. Not the stiff-legged wariness that preceded a growl, but something older and stranger. A recognition of a kind that bypassed judgment entirely. Nicholas followed the line of Thunder's focus. A girl in a grey apron was clearing dead bracken from the base of the courtyard wall. She was perhaps 20 yards away, working with her back to them. And she had not appeared to notice the approaching party. She was nobody Nicholas had consciously registered before one of the new autumn intake, he thought, though he could not have said with certainty. Dark red hair scraped back under a cap. Small hands moving steadily through the dried bracken. Thunder stopped walking. He stopped so completely, so without the usual negotiation of slowing and reluctance, that the lead went from slack to taut before Nicholas had processed what was happening. The old dog sat down on the frozen ground. Not the aggressive crouch of an animal preparing to act, simply sat, with the unhurried deliberateness of a creature that has reached its destination. Hugo, ahead, had not noticed. Sir Edmund was still talking about drainage. Nicholas stood. The girl, alerted perhaps by some peripheral awareness of stillness where there should have been movement, turned. She saw the party first, a sweep of recognition moving across her face, quickly controlled. The natural response of a servant encountering her employer and guests unexpectedly. She made to step back, to fold herself out of the way in the manner of someone practiced at disappearing. Then she saw Thunder. Something in her face went very still. Not fear, or not only fear. It was the stillness of a person encountering a calculation they had not prepared for. One that required all available attention. Her hands, which had been drawing back the bracken, stopped. The Hound looked at her. She did not look at the Hound. She looked, with great precision, at the ground approximately 2 feet in front of it. Her hands hung at her sides. She was breathing. Nicholas, watching, was almost certain she was counting her breaths. Your Grace. Hugo had turned back. His voice had a quality Nicholas had not heard in it before, not quite alarm, but the careful steadiness of a man suppressing it. His eyes were moving between the girl and the Hound with an expression that lasted only a fraction of a second before his face reorganized itself into its habitual authority. She's one of the new courtyard staff, Hugo said. I'll have her moved along. That won't be necessary. Hugo paused. The Hound is sitting down, Nicholas said. I'm aware that he was watching the girl. She had not moved. She had not made a sound. Her eyes remained on the ground before the dog, and her hands remained at her sides. And she was doing, he could not account for it better than this, she was doing nothing, with a concentration and a precision that made the nothing into something else entirely. Thunder's tail moved. Once, against the frozen ground. A low sound, somewhere between a breath and a note, was very nearly audible from the direction of the girl's closed lips, so faint that Nicholas was not certain afterward that he had heard it, or whether he had only seen it. A slight movement at the corner of her mouth, suppressed before it became anything. Her jaw tightening a fraction of a second later, stopping something. The calculation landed on him cleanly and all at once. She was stopping something. Whatever she had almost done, she had caught it and prevented it, with the reflexive speed of long practice. Move her, Hugo said again. There was an edge in it now. Nicholas handed the lead to his groom and walked toward the girl. She watched him come. Her expression was composed in the careful way of someone who has had to compose it in a hurry and hopes the effort doesn't show. Up close, he could see that she was younger than had thought, not yet 20, perhaps, and that her eyes, which he had expected to drop immediately, did not. They stayed on him. Not with insolence. With the wary, measuring quality of an animal that has learned that looking away from a threat doesn't make it stop being one. What's your name? He said. She said nothing. Behind him, Hugo made a short, disgusted sound. She doesn't speak much. Your Grace. I apologize for. I wasn't asking you. Nicholas kept his attention on the girl. Your name. The wind moved across the courtyard. Somewhere in the east kennels, one of the pack hounds gave a single bark and was silent. The girl looked at him for another moment. Then she looked, briefly, at Thunder, still sitting, still watching her with that expression of grave recognition that Nicholas had, in 3 years, never seen on the animal's face. She looked back at Nicholas. Maeve, she said, her voice was low, roughened slightly by cold or disuse. And she offered nothing else with it. Just the one word, plain and flat as a stone placed on a table. Maeve. He repeated it without inflection. How long have you been at Morden? A pause. 3 weeks, Your Grace. Where were you before? Another pause. Longer. The wariness in her face sharpened into something more specific, something that recognized the direction of a question and was deciding how much ground to give. Various places, she said. Hugo stepped forward. Your Grace. The guests will manage without me for another minute. Nicholas studied the girl, the careful face, the hands that had gone back to her sides, the way she stood with her weight slightly forward, not braced for a blow but ready to move. The way a person stood when they had learned that the difference between the two mattered. You've worked with hounds before. It was not a question. He watched her understand that. No, Your Grace. She said. The lie was delivered without a flicker. He almost admired it. Thunder made a low sound, not a growl, not any sound Nicholas had a name for, and shifted his weight on the frozen ground. The girl's attention moved to the dog for one instant, quick and involuntary. And in that instant her face was different. Something moved through it that she had not consented to, some old recognition, some grief that had gotten through before she could close the door. She shuttered it immediately. But Nicholas had seen it. See that she's reassigned to the inner kennels, he said to Hugo, without looking at him. Under Aldrich, the silence that followed had a specific texture. The inner kennels, Hugo repeated. With the careful neutrality of a man translating something into a language he speaks badly. That's what I said. Nicholas turned back toward his guests. And Maeve, she was already drawing back, already reducing herself. The way she had been doing since he walked toward her. She stopped. Don't disappear, he said. The inner kennels smelled of straw and warm animal and the particular mineral tang of old stone that has been scrubbed clean too many times to hold any other scent. It was, by modern standards, a comfortable place to work. The hounds were professional creatures. They did not require much beyond feeding, cleaning, and the occasional management of disputes about hierarchy, which Aldrich, the head kennel man, handled with the weary competence of a man who has long since stopped finding it surprising that animals have opinions. Maeve had been in the inner kennels for 4 days when Hugo found a reason to come that he did not come for her directly. That was not his method. He came to speak with Aldrich Abo. A matter concerning the feed allocation for the next month, and he stayed longer than the conversation required, and at the end of it he paused near the section where Maeve was replacing the straw bedding in the far run. The new girl, he said to Aldrich, but loudly enough. She settling in? Well enough, Aldrich said, with the brevity of a man who did not find the question interesting. Quiet thing. Hugo moved along the run, hands behind his back, examining the kennels with the proprietary gaze of a man surveying his own territory. I've known mutes more forthcoming. Aldrich said nothing. He was checking the water bowls. Does she understand instruction? Hugo stopped near Maeve. She did not look up from the straw. Can you understand instruction, girl? She continued working. When I ask a question, Hugo said, his voice dropping to the register he used for things he wanted only one person to hear. I expect an answer. Even a nod will do. Have you got that much in you, or did whatever ditch you climbed out of take that too? She set down the straw. Straightened. Looked at the middle distance, which was the wall above his left shoulder, which was not his face. Which was the safest available option. She nodded. Good. He didn't move. The Duke has a passing curiosity about unusual things. It won't last. His Grace has an estate to run and guests to manage and considerably more pressing concerns than whatever trick you found to make old dogs sit up and pay attention. You understand me? She said nothing that I said. Hugo repeated, quietly, do you understand me? Yes, she said. The word came out as flat and uninflected as she could make it. Hugo studied her for a moment with the pale gray eyes that assessed and did not feel. Then he nodded, once, in the manner of a man confirming something he already knew, and walked back to Aldrich and resumed the conversation about feed allocation as though none of the preceding 2 minutes had occurred. That night, Maeve sat on her narrow bed in the servant's attic and took the bone whistle out of the apron pocket and held it in both hands. It was not much to look at. It was the length of her middle finger and the width of her thumb, carved from something dense and cream-colored, smooth with age and handling. There were no markings on it. It had no ornamentation of any kind. It was the most functional object she had ever owned, and also the only one that had come to her rather than being assigned to her. And the distinction felt significant in a way she had no vocabulary for. She turned it over in her hands. She remembered very little. She had been told, over the years, that she remembered even less than she believed, that the mind manufactured comfort from fragments and called it memory. And that whatever she thought she carried from that time was more construction than truth. She had been told this by people who had reasons to tell it to her, and she had noted their reasons even as she absorbed the words, what she knew, a voice that was low and unhurried. The voice of a man who did not speak loudly because he had never needed to. The smell of dogs and cold air and something like pine resin. The weight of a small hand, her own hand, smaller placed over a larger one, being shown how the lips positioned themselves, how the breath moved. How the column of air was shaped by the tongue and the angle of the teeth, not into a note but into a frequency, a specific and unrepeatable frequency. This is how it goes, remember, your mouth knows it even when your head doesn't. Your mouth will always know. She put the whistle back in the pocket. She would not think about Hugo Cru's voice, which had the quality of something that expected no resistance because it had encountered none. She would not think about the expression on his face when he watched her. Which was not dislike. She had recognized this in the courtyard and recognized it again today. It was not dislike but something with sharper edges. Something that required management in a way that dislike did not. She would think about nothing. She was very good at thinking about nothing. She turned off the candle and lay down in the dark and listened to the wind work at the window frame, and was quiet. And waited for morning. Nicholas had read his father's journals 3 times, the first time had been in the weeks immediately after the funeral, when he had been functioning on the particular clarity of grief that resembles competence and is not. He had read them quickly. Looking for practical information, decisions outstanding, obligations unmet, the architecture of a life he was expected to step into and maintain. He had found what he needed and had put them away. The second time had been 6 months later. When the practical clarity had worn off and something else had moved in. He had read them slowly, looking for the man himself, for some residue of character that the title and the duties and the public face had obscured. He had found him, partially. In the margins small annotations in a different ink, added later. Which had the quality of a person arguing with their own past self. He had put them away again. The third time was the night after the courtyard incident that he did not take them out with any particular intention. He found himself in his father's study which he had kept. Precisely and without examining why, in the same arrangement as his father had maintained, standing in front of the bookcase with a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking, and the journals were there. And the thing that had happened in the courtyard was still sitting at the back of his mind with the solidity of an unanswered question. And he took down the relevant volume. His father had kept meticulous notes on Thunder's training. Nicholas had known this in the abstract. He had known that his father had spent 2 years working with a trainer brought specifically from the West. That Thunder was considered the finest result of that work. That something had interrupted the arrangement before it was complete and that this had been a source of some frustration. He had not previously sat down to read the training records carefully. October 3C worked him on the long lead today. The boy is exceptional. I said this to C, and he laughed, and D said Thunder was only doing what his nature intended and the credit belonged to the breeding. I told him the breeding is everywhere but the results are not. He is too modest. He is also correct. October 17 The whistle work is progressing. C explains it as a matter of frequency, not volume. Not tone in the conventional sense. But a specific band that cuts through noise and registers somewhere below conscious hearing. He has carved 3 instruments. 1 for Thunder. 1 for the backup work. 1 that he says he is keeping. November 2 asked C today why he keeps the 3rd whistle if he doesn't intend to use it. He was quiet. Or a moment, in that way he has, that means he is deciding whether to say the actual thing. Then he said it was for his daughter. That she would need it someday. I asked him why. He said, because she'll come back here eventually, and when she does. I want her to be able to prove who she is. Nicholas read the entry again. The whiskey glass was still in his hand. He set it down on his father's desk. She'll come back here eventually. He sat down. He read the next entry. And the next. The records grew more fragmented. In December his father's handwriting deteriorated when he was tired or distracted, and there were gaps of weeks where nothing was recorded at all. Then, in the January entries, there was a break of a different quality. Not a gap. A stop. The last entry concerning the training was dated the 14th of January, 8 years ago, and it recorded Thunder's weight and the status of his conditioning and the particular exercise performed that morning. And then it ended mid-page, and the next entry was dated 3 weeks later and concerned a matter of fencing on the south boundary and made no reference to the training at all. No record of dismissal. No record of departure. No record of any kind of conclusion, Hugo had told him. When Nicholas had taken over the estate, that the trainer had moved on. Went back west, Your Grace, the way that sort does. Nicholas had accepted this as he had accepted many things in those early months as background information, as context. As the shape of a situation he didn't have the capacity to examine. That he closed the journal. He looked at Thunder, who had been sleeping in front of the fire since they'd come in and who now, with the ambient awareness of old dogs, opened one eye. The girl's name is Maeve. Nicholas said. Thunder's eye remained open. She stopped herself, he said. In the courtyard. She was going to make a sound. And she stopped herself. And you sat down anyway. The fire settled. A log shifted and threw brief gold across the ceiling. That he thought about a man who had carved 3 bone whistles, one of them for a daughter who would need it someday, because she'll come back here eventually, and when she does. I want her to be able to prove who she is. He thought about Hugo Crew's face in the courtyard, the 2 seconds of something that wasn't concern about a dog, and the speed with which it had been covered over. He thought, move her, said twice. The second time with an edge, Nicholas looked at the fire. He picked up the journal again and found the entry for October 17th. Read it once more. He has carved 3 instruments. 1 for Thunder. 1 for the backup work. 1 that he says he is keeping. That he sat with that for a long time. The north end of the shooting grounds was the least managed part of Morden's estate. The gamekeepers worked the middle sections, the coverts planted for birds, the cleared paths that allowed clean shooting lines. The careful ecological maintenance that turned wildness into a product. But the north end was where the grounds ran up against the moorland proper. Where the planting gave way to gorse and exposed limestone and the kind of terrain that had not been asked for anything and did not intend to start. The boundary between managed land and unmanaged land was not marked. You felt it in the change underfoot. The way the ground stopped being cooperative, Maeve had been assigned to clear the old trap lines on the north boundary, rusted iron fragments from a previous keeper's regime, half buried in the frozen ground. Which represented both a hazard and an eyesore. It was the kind of work that was given to the person considered most expendable to the cold. She had been working since first light, moving along the line of stakes that marked where the old traps had been set. Prying each one loose with a hooked iron bar and dropping it into the canvas sack over her shoulder. She was nearly at the northern edge when she heard the boar. She did not hear it as a sound at first. She heard it as an absence of other sounds, the birds stopping. The particular quality of stillness that preceded disruption. She straightened. She turned toward the sound before it existed. The animal came out of the gorse 20 yards to her left. It was not large, as boars went, perhaps 2 years old, a young male. But it had the specific quality of panic that made size irrelevant. Something had frightened it from the dense cover to her left, and it was running with the blunt, committed momentum of a creature that has decided on a direction and is not open to alternatives. It hit the old wire that had been strung between 2 rotted fence posts at the northern boundary and went down hard, one foreleg tangling, and then it was up again, but not right. The leg was wrong. And it was making a sound now, and it turned. It found the nearest thing. The nearest thing was Thunder. The old hound had been at Nicholas' side. The Duke had come to the north boundary to look at the moorland drainage. Accompanied by only a single groom who was carrying the measuring equipment 20 yards back. Thunder was off lead, as he often was at the estate's edges, moving at his own pace. He was old and the boundary wire confused him, and he had paused to work out his relationship to it when the boar turned. And the boar was already moving before the old dog processed what was happening. Thunder charged. It was not the charge of a young dog. It was the automatic, deeply habitual response of an animal that had spent its entire working life believing that the correct answer to anything that moved aggressively was to meet it immediately. His body remembered things his joints had begun to forget. He hit the boar at a full run. The boar went down again. But Thursday. Ender went with it, and when they separated, the hound was making a sound that had nothing professional in it, a high, broken sound, more surprise than pain, and he was scrambling back toward Nicholas with his gait wrong, his shoulder impacted. Confused and suddenly afraid, and then he kept going, because he was hurt, and because the boar was still making noise. And because he was old and frightened, and the part of him that had been trained to run toward things had temporarily overridden the part that processed consequences. Thunder turned, still scrambling, and ran directly at Nicholas, not at the boar. At his master. The protective instinct inverted by pain into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like attack. Nicholas did not have a crop. The groom was too far back. He had 2 seconds. Perhaps 3. Maeve was 15 yards away. She had watched all of it, the boar, the collision. Thunder's confused reversal with the frozen attention of someone who recognizes a sequence of events unfolding faster than intervention should be possible. She saw the dog's trajectory. She saw Nicholas' hands come up. The instinctive preparation of a man who knows what is about to hit him and has no means to stop it. Her hand went into the apron pocket. She did not think about it. The hand had been making that movement, in suppressed rehearsal, for 6 years. And when the rehearsal ended, it was already done, fingers closing on the smooth, cool length, lifting it out, bringing it to her lips. The sound that came out was not loud. That was the first thing that struck the groom, later, when he tried to describe it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout or a shriek or any of the sounds a person made when they wanted to stop something large and moving. It was a sound with a specific shape, a column of air with a frequency that seemed to go somewhere below the register of normal hearing. And it lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and it was unlike anything he had heard a human instrument produce. Thunder stopped, not slowed. Stopped with the abruptness of an animal that has received a command it recognizes at a level below thought, below decision. Below anything that could be reasoned with or overridden. His front feet hit the ground and stayed there. His whole body arrested, mid-motion, 3 steps from Nicholas that he stood, then, slowly, with the deflating dignity of a very old dog that has remembered what it is. He sat down on the frozen ground. The boar, limping badly, found a gap in the gorse and disappeared. Nobody moved. Maeve stood 15 yards away with the bone whistle still at her lips, and her lips were still in the position the sound required. And her eyes were on Thunder because that was where she had aimed the sound, and she had not yet given herself permission to look anywhere else. The groom said nothing. He was a practical young man, and he had just witnessed something he had no category for, and he was waiting to see whether anyone else was going to address it before he decided how to respond. Nicholas looked at his dog, sitting calm on the ground 3 feet from where it would have hit him. He looked at the girl. She lowered the whistle. She did not put it away. Her hand came down to her side and the whistle came with it. Held between her fingers, no longer hidden, and she stood in the thin winter light with the evidence of what she was simply present in her hand, and she did not try to explain it. And she did not try to disappear. She looked at him. It was the first time she had looked at him directly, not at the space above his shoulder or the ground before his feet or the careful middle distance she usually chose for safety. Directly at him. With an expression he could not name, because it was not fear and not defiance and not any of the things he expected from someone who had just been caught doing something they had spent weeks concealing. It was something more like recognition, the look of a person who has been waiting for a particular moment and has just identified it. She had stopped something large and dangerous with a sound no larger than a human breath. She had done it with a bone instrument no bigger than her finger. She had done it with the particular frequency that his father's journals described. That his father's trainer had spent 2 years teaching to one specific animal, that his father's trainer had said he was keeping the 3rd copy of because she'll need it someday, to prove who she is. Nicholas held her gaze. Come up to the house this evening, he said. His voice was level. After supper. Tell Mrs. Aldrich I've asked for you. He picked up Thunder's lead. He walked back to the groom, and the groom, with admirable professionalism, said nothing at all. The study was not the formal room he used for estate business, that was on the ground floor, off the entrance hall, furnished for the conducting of transactions, 2 chairs, a wide desk. The correct distance between parties. The room Nicholas had asked Maeve to come to was his father's study, on the 1st floor. A smaller room that smelled of old paper and the specific kind of wood polish that meant someone had been caring for the bookshelves for decades. There was a fire. There were books on every surface. On the desk, open, was one of the journals. Maeve stood inside the door. She had come directly from the kennel staff supper, which meant she was wearing her work clothes, the grey apron, the dark dress beneath it, and her hair was beginning to escape its pins after a full day's work, and she looked, in the warm light of the study, like a person who has been asked somewhere they did not expect to be asked. She was taking in the room with the quick peripheral assessment of someone mapping territory. The bone whistle was not in the apron pocket. Nicholas noticed this. She had put it somewhere else. Inside the dress, perhaps. Against her skin. Somewhere harder to reach. He waited until she had stopped moving, stopped the small internal cataloging of exits and surfaces, and then he crossed to the desk and turned the open journal toward her. "Come here," he said. Not an invitation. A direction. She came. She stopped on the other side of the desk, which she chose as her position without being told, which put the desk between them. Which was a reasonable choice for someone in her situation, and which he did not take personally. He pointed to the entry. October 17th, she read. He watched her read. He was good at watching people process information. It was one of the skills the title had required him to develop, and what he saw move through her face as she read was not what he had expected. There was recognition. Yes. But the quality of it was not the recognition of finding a name you know. It was the recognition of finding a shape you have been carrying without knowing it was a shape, something that had existed only as weight, as pressure, as the reason certain things felt the way they felt. Suddenly acquiring its outline, her eyes stopped moving. He says he is keeping the third one. For his daughter. She'll need it someday, to prove who she is. She stood very still. The notation in the margin, Nicholas said, is my father's writing. The main entries are from 1814. This one is October. The margin note was added later, different ink, different angle. He came back to it. She did not look up. The training records stop in January of 1815. He said, there is no record of dismissal. No record of departure. Hugo Crew told me, when I took over the estate, that the trainer had moved on. Gone back west. He paused. There is no record of that either. She was still looking at the page. I am going to ask you something, Nicholas said. And I would prefer an honest answer, but I am not going to compel one. You're not required to tell me anything you don't want to tell me. He waited until she looked up. Where did the whistle come from? Silence, not the silence she used as a wall. He had been watching her long enough to distinguish between them. This was different. This was a silence with movement inside it, the silence of a person measuring how much weight a surface could hold before committing to stand on it. A man. She said. Her voice was low, careful. I don't know his name. I was very young. 5, perhaps 6. He put it in my hand and showed me the position. He said I had to practice until my mouth knew it without thinking. A pause. He said that when I used it, I should be somewhere safe. That the sound would be. She stopped. Recognized. Nicholas looked at her. The fire moved behind him. The shadows in the room shifted and settled. Did he tell you where he worked? No. Did he tell you who he worked for? No. Did he tell you his name? She was quiet for a moment. He said it didn't matter. That I would know everything I needed to know when I was older, and that the whistle would do the telling. She looked at the journal again, at the ink that had been dry for 8 years. He called me by my name, Maeve, yes, and nothing else. She hesitated. The small hesitation of someone deciding whether the next thing is safe to give. He called me M.O. Croy, she said. My heart. It is Irish. He had an Irish voice. Her eyes came up to his and they were steady. But they were steady in the way of a person holding something still by force of will, not by the absence of motion. The man in your father's journal. The trainer. He had an Irish name. The C. Yes, Nicholas said. What was it? He turned to a different page. Pointed. She looked at the name. He watched her read it once. And then again. He watched her read it the way you read something you want to be certain of before you let it be real. Her lips shaped the syllables without sound. Cormac, she did not cry. She stood on the other side of his father's desk and looked at the name of the man who had put a bone whistle in her hand and shown her how to hold her lips and told her that the sound would do the telling, and she read his name twice without sound, and she was very still, then she put her fingers on the page. Not covering the name. Just beside it, as though checking that the paper was real, Cormac. She said, the word sat in the room with the quality of something that had been looking for a place to land for a very long time. Nicholas said nothing. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence, and he had learned, from long acquaintance with grief in its various forms, that filling silence was usually an act performed for the comfort of the person watching rather than the person feeling that he let it be. After a while, she took her hand off the page. He's buried here, she said. It was not a question that I don't know. Nicholas said. I intend to find out. She looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. It was not gratitude, exactly, it had more spine than gratitude. More weight. It was something closer to the look of a person who has been told that the ground they're standing on is not going to move, and is deciding whether to believe it. You should know, she said, that Hugo Crew told me something. The day you moved me to the inner kennels. He told me your interest wouldn't last. That you had more important concerns. She said it without visible emotion, as a piece of information she thought he should have. Nicholas was quiet for a moment. What did you think of that? He asked that. I thought he believed it. A pause. I thought he needed to believe it. That he looked at her. Go back to the kennels, he said. Get some rest. I have more reading to do tonight. And tomorrow I'd like you to come with me when I walk Thunder. I have more questions. She nodded. She moved toward the door. Maeve, she stopped. He named the whistle work after you, Nicholas said. In the margins. October's entry. He wrote it in a different hand. The later one. He called it the Maeve method. He said it without particular inflection, as a fact. I thought you should know that. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then she left. He sat down at his father's desk, pulled the journal closer, and turned back to January of 1815. They walked Thunder in the mornings. Now that it had become a pattern without being declared one. Nicholas would come to the inner kennels at 7:30, and Maeve would be there. And they would take the old Hound out through the east gate and along the moorland path that ran parallel to the northern boundary. Hugo was not present for these walks. This was not accidental. The first 2 mornings they had spoken very little. Nicholas asked questions about Thunder's condition. His shoulder that had been impacted by the boar was healing, but slowly, and Maeve answered them in the short, specific manner of someone reporting observable facts. On the 3rd morning, Nicholas stopped at the high point of the path where the moors opened to the west and asked her to tell him everything she remembered. You don't need to make it coherent, he said. Just whatever is there. She was quiet for a long moment. Thunder moved slowly along the path ahead of them, nose down. Conducting his own investigation of the morning. Cold, she said. I remember cold, and dogs. A lot of dogs. Not afraid of them, they were just present. The way weather is present. She stopped. A fire. A very large fire. Bigger than I understood how to make. Someone making it while I watched. Another pause. Hands. I remember hands. Large, very careful. They smelled of something. Pine resin, Nicholas said. She looked at him. My father noted it. He said. He wrote that Cormac's hands always smelled of the resin he used to treat the leather. The leads and the muzzles. She turned back to the moors. Her jaw moved slightly, the way it did when she was processing something she was not ready to speak about. Pine resin. She said. Yes, they walked. How did you come to Morden? He asked. The first time. When you came 3 weeks ago. A woman in Harrogate had a notice posted. She was looking for general labor for an estate in the north. She didn't name the estate. Maeve looked at the ground. I had been in Harrogate for 4 months. Before that, Leeds. Before that, a number of places. She said it without self-pity, as a simple itinerary. The work here was the first that included the kennels. That was why I applied, and before Harrogate, a longer pause. I was with a family in Durham. For 2 years. I had been sent there. I was told my parents had died. That I had no family, that the family in Durham would give me a place. She paused. They were not unkind. They were indifferent. I left when I was 15. That who sent you there? A man. He told me he worked for the family of my father's employer. She said it flatly, without accusation in her voice. Which somehow made it worse. He said it had been arranged. Nicholas walked that he had found 3 more relevant entries the night before. Working through the January journals with the focused attention he usually reserved for legal documents. The entries were not dramatic. They were the records of a man trying to keep his accounting of things accurate while managing something that was not accountable. January 16 crew tells me C has N. OT come in this morning. Unusual. Will inquire. January 18 still no word. Crew says he checked the cottage, found it empty. I have a feeling I cannot account for. January 24 crew reports that C has turned up. An accident on the North Moor. He says. Fell in the dark. I have told myself I believe this. I am not certain I do. The girl is apparently already placed. Crew handled it. I find I cannot look at this entry for very long. Nicholas had read that last entry 4 times. That I find I cannot look at this entry for very long. His fath. Had known. Not what Hugo had done, perhaps not the specific shape of it, but he had known the shape of something, had chosen not to examine it, had told himself a story with a gap in the middle and had noted, in his own handwriting, that he was aware the gap was there. This was not the father Nicholas had spent 2 years building in memory. This was a man who had looked at something uncomfortable and turned away, and had been honest enough with himself to write down that he had done it. And had then turned away from that too. That he did not say any of this to Maeve. What he said was, I found more entries. From January of 1815. That she waited. My father wrote that Hugo reported the accident. That Cormac had been found on the North Moor. He wrote that you had already been placed. He kept his voice level. He wrote that Hugo had handled it. The wind moved across the high ground. Thursday. Ender had stopped to examine something in the bracken. He wrote, Nicholas said, that he found he could not look at the entry for very long. Maeve was still. He knew something was wrong. She said. It was not an accusation. It was the same flat recitation of fact that she used for everything. He was coming to understand, a particular discipline around the things that had the most capacity to hurt her. She reported them rather than felt them, in the moment. And the feeling went somewhere else. He knew something was not right, Nicholas said. I cannot tell you, from what he wrote, how much he knew beyond that. I believe he stopped. He was careful with this word. I believe he told himself a story that allowed him not to look further. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who did not always choose to see what was in front of him. A long silence. The girl was placed. Maeve said. That is what he wrote. Yes. I was placed. Yes. She looked west, toward the grey horizon where the moors ran up against a sky the color of old pewter. Her profile, in the thin morning light, was composed with a precision that cost something. Then I need to know, she said. What Hugo Crew put in my father's place. In the records. In whatever records exist. I need to know what story he told, in writing, that made it possible for a man to disappear from a position he held and no one to ask further questions. I intend to find out. Nicholas said. I have been looking. I have not yet found the document. But I know where my father kept things he considered sensitive. Tonight I am going back to the study. She nodded. Maeve. He waited until she turned. I want to be direct with you. What I believe happened, what I believe Hugo Crew did, is not something I can address on the basis of journal entries alone. I need documentation. When I have it, I will act on it. But I will not move before I have it. Because moving without it will give him the opportunity to construct a defense that may be impossible to overcome. He looked at her steadily. Can you continue for a few more days in your current position? Knowing what you know? She looked at him for a moment. I've been managing Hugo Crew for 3 years, she said. I can manage him for a few more days. Hugo came to the study 2 days later. He came in the morning, when the household was occupied and the staff movements predictable. Which meant he had timed it. He knocked with the brisk knock of a man presenting himself on business rather than requesting an audience, and Nicholas told him to come in, and he came in, and he closed the door. He was carrying something under one arm, a ledger, the old kind, with a cracked leather cover. He placed it on the desk. The game records, he said. From 1813 through 1816. I thought your grace might find them useful, given the recent questions about that period. Nicholas looked at the ledger. He did not touch it. Sit down. Crew. Hugo sat. He had the settled posture of a man who has decided in advance how a conversation will go and has arrived prepared for it. That I understand, Hugo said, that your grace has been reviewing the late Duke's personal journals. That I have done a natural thing. In the circumstances. He folded his hands. I wonder if your grace has found anything that requires clarification. The journals were personal documents, and the late Duke was a man of strong feelings. Things were sometimes recorded in a form that reflected the feeling of the moment rather than the facts of the situation. What sort of things? The matter of the Irish trainer, for instance. Hugo's voice was measured, the voice of a man being patient with something he finds unnecessary. Cormac. He came to us well recommended, and he was skilled. I won't deny that. The record will show that. But he was also, over time, a man with certain habits. There were items that went missing from the kennels in his last months. Small things first, then less small. I gave him opportunities to account for them. He did not take them. When he disappeared in January of 1815. I suspected, and I still suspect, that he saw what was coming and chose the resolution he preferred. That he said it cleanly, without visible effort. The particular fluency of a man who has told a story enough times that the words have worn smooth, and the child. Nicholas said that a fractional pause. His daughter. Yes. She was present when I found him, on the North Moor. Hugo adjusted his register slightly, introducing something that might be read as regret. A young child, no family that we could identify. No provision made. I took it upon myself to arrange a situation for her. It was not strictly within my remit, but the circumstances seemed to require it. I believe she was placed with a family in Durham. You believe that I have no record of the specific arrangement at this remove. Your Grace. It was 8 years ago. I did what seemed best. Nicholas said nothing. The silence lasted long enough that Hugo's hands, folded on his knee, shifted very slightly. The girl in the kennels. Hugo said. The one your grace has been walking thunder with. I wonder if your grace is aware that she has been asking questions among the staff. About the history of the kennels. About previous staff. His voice remained measured, but something had entered its texture, a quality that was almost, but not quite, urgency. I raise it only in the spirit of transparency. A servant who asks questions of that kind, in that pattern, may have motivations that aren't immediately obvious. I would not want your grace to be in a position of having been misled. Nicholas looked at him. Misled. He said that it is possible. Hugo said carefully, that she is not what she appears to be. That her presence here is not coincidental. He paused, and then, with the air of a man making a reluctant addition, the late trainer had, it was known, a way with dogs that was specific to his methods. If someone wished to present themselves as connected to him as his daughter, for instance, an old bone whistle of the right type would go some distance toward making that case. It would not, of course, make it true. Nicholas was quiet for a long moment. That he looked at the ledger on the desk. Thank you for bringing the records, he said. I'll review them. Hugo stood. He had the bearing of a man who has performed a necessary task efficiently. Of course, your grace. I'm at your grace's disposal. As always that he left, Nicholas remained at the desk after the door closed, looking at the ledger. He did not touch it. He was thinking about the specific timing of Hugo's visit, not what he had said, but when he had chosen to say it. The timing of a man who had heard something, or suspected something, and had decided that the moment required a preemptive move. The timing of a man who had spent years ensuring that a particular history stayed in a particular shape, and who had recently had cause to wonder whether it would hold. He pulled out his father's journal and opened it to January 24th. I find I cannot look at this entry for very long. He looked at it for a long time, then he went to the cabinet in the corner of the room, the one with the broken hinge that nobody had repaired, and began to look for a different kind of record. The cabinet in the corner of his father's study had a broken hinge. Nicholas had noticed it the first week after inheriting the estate and had added it to a list of minor repairs that had not yet been completed. Because there was always something more pressing than a cabinet hinge, and the cabinet itself appeared to hold nothing of consequence. A few old maps, a set of geological surveys from the 1790s. The kind of accumulated material that an estate office gathers and nobody ever discards because discarding requires a decision. He had looked in it twice before. Both times he had opened the door, assessed the contents as administrative sediment, and closed it again. On the third evening after Hugo's visit, he pulled everything out. He stacked the maps on the floor. He removed the surveys. He took out the folded broadsheets from a decade ago that had been used as packing material at the back, and the two broken inkwells that had been placed there as if waiting to be repaired, and the brass compass that had lost its needle. He removed all of it until the cabinet was empty and he could see the back panel clearly. The back panel was slightly proud of the frame on the left side, not much. Perhaps a quarter of an inch. The kind of irregularity that read as poor craftsmanship. Or old wood settling, the kind that the eye recorded and the mind dismissed. He pressed it. The panel swung inward on a small pivot at its center, revealing a narrow space behind it, perhaps 4 inches deep, running the full height of the cabinet. Inside the space, held in place by 2 small leather loops nailed to the interior wall, was a document wallet of the kind used by his father's solicitors. Stiff leather, tied with a waxed cord. Still intact, Nicholas lifted it out. He untied the cord at the desk. Inside were 2 documents. The first was a contract of employment, formal, dated, bearing the seal of the estate and his father's signature. It named Cormac Doyle of County Clare as head kennelman at Morden Estate, with a commencement date of March 1813 and terms that included annual wages, a cottage on the estate grounds, and the standard provisions for a long-term position. It was a complete document, legally sound. The record of a legitimate appointment. A man with this contract was not a drifter or a thief. He was a permanent member of the Morden household. Protected by the terms his employer had signed. Nicholas set it aside. The second document was a letter. It was written in a hand he did not recognize, careful, clerical. The hand of someone who wrote official communications as a regular occupation. It was addressed to a magistrate in the nearest town, a name Nicholas recognized as having held the position in the years before the current holder. It was dated the 22nd of January, 1815. Dear Sir, I write on behalf of the Duke of Morden's estate in the matter of a recent occurrence requiring official notice. An employee of the estate, one Cormac Doyle, an Irish national, was found deceased on the northern moorland on January 20th. Having apparently lost his way in poor weather conditions. Mr. Doyle had been in the employ of the estate but had recently been the subject of internal inquiry regarding missing items of estate property, given the circumstances of his employment and the circumstances of his death. It is the considered view of the estate management that a formal inquiry would serve little purpose and might produce results that would reflect poorly on all parties. We are confident that you will agree that the matter is best considered closed. The subject's minor child has been removed to a sway table situation and will require no further consideration. Yours in service, H. Crew. Head Gamekeeper. Nicholas read it once. He read it again. The subject's minor child has been removed to a suitable situation and will require no further consideration. He set the letter down on the desk beside the contract. He looked at them both. The contract that proved Cormac Doyle had been a legitimate, protected employee, and the letter that had ensured no one would look closely at how he had died, written by the man who had told the Duke he had simply wandered off. He sat for a long time, then he sent for Maeve. She came in her work clothes again. Because it was evening and she had been at the kennels, and she stood inside the study door in the same way she had the first time reading the room, reading him. Assessing what kind of conversation this was going to be. He did not make her come to the desk. He carried both documents to where she stood and held them out. She took them. She read the contract first. He watched her read her father's name, Cormac Doyle of County Clare, and the date. And the terms. And his father's signature at the bottom. Her face was very still. Then she read the letter. She read it more slowly than she had read the contract. He watched her reach the subject's minor child has been removed to a suitable situation and will require no further consideration, and he watched her top. She read it again. When she looked up, her eyes were dry. She had the expression of someone who has just had a thing confirmed that they had already, in some interior place, known the particular quality of a wound that has been present for a long time finally being named. That he killed my father, she said. And then he wrote a letter to make sure nobody would ask why. Yes, Nicholas said. She held the letter for another moment. Then, deliberately, she held it back out to him. Is it enough? She said. To act on, yes, he said. It's enough. She nodded once. The nod of a person closing one calculation and opening the next. Then tell me what you need me to do. He looked at her, the composed face, the steady hands. The bone whistle that he knew was somewhere against her skin. A girl who had arrived at the estate where her father had worked and died without knowing it, who had spent 3 years being quietly managed by the man who had ended her father's life and buried the evidence. Who had held every piece of herself under strict control for a very long time. I need you to come to the hall tomorrow evening, he said. I'm going to ask Crewe to be there, and Aldrich, and Mrs. Renner. And 2 of the estate's senior tenants who have standing in the local records. I'm going to read both of these documents aloud. He paused. I need you to be present. Not to speak, unless you choose to. But present. She looked at him for a moment. Hell, deny it, she said. Hell, try. Nicholas said. The letter is in his own hand. I have a sample of his writing from the household accounts. They match. Something moved in her face, not satisfaction, not triumph, but the particular expression of a person who has been waiting, for a very long time, for the ground to become solid enough to stand on without caution. It'll be there, she said. Nicholas convened them in the estate hall at 7 o'clock. It was not the formal dining room, which would have suggested a social occasion. It was not his study, which would have made it private. The estate hall was the working room of Morden, the room where tenancy disputes were heard, where accounts were reviewed with the senior staff, where the estate conducted its business as an institution rather than as a household. It was a room that meant something. And Nicholas had chosen it with this in mind. He had arranged a single long table with chairs for 6, himself at the head, Aldrich and Mrs. Renner on one side, 2 of the senior tenants, a man named Hartwick who had farmed Morden's eastern land for 30 years. And a woman named Briggs who held the mill lease and had known the late Duke well on the other. Hugo Crewe was placed at the far end, which Nicholas had also chosen with care. Maeve stood near the door. Hugo had come in last. He had looked at the assembled company with the expression of a man who has walked into an unusual situation and is assessing how unusual, and then he had looked at Maeve by the door. And Nicholas had watched what happened in his face in that fraction of a second. Not surprise, not guilt in any recognizable form, but a quality of rapid recalculation. Of a man updating his estimate of how far a situation had progressed. He sat down. He folded his hands on the table with the same composed authority he always brought to any room he entered. Nicholas placed both documents on the table. I've asked you all here, he said, because what I'm going to read has bearing on Morden's record as an institution. And I want it heard by people who have standing in this community. He looked at Hartwick and Briggs in particular. What I am about to read is not a matter I discovered through any special effort. It was in my father's study. It had been there for 8 years. He picked up the contract. He read it in full. The date. The name Cormac Doyle of County Clare. The terms. The signature. When he finished, he set it down. this is the employment contract of a man who worked at Morden from March of 1813 until January of 1815. He was not a casual laborer. He was not a temporary appointment. He was a permanent member of this household. Protected by an agreement my father signed and sealed. He paused. In January of 1815, he died on the northern moor. No inquiry was conducted. No record of the circumstances of his death was placed in the estate files. I found this contract in a hidden compartment in my father's cabinet. Where it had apparently been placed in order not to be found, the room was quiet. Aldrich was looking at the contract with the expression of a man recalculating a history he thought he knew. Mrs. Renner had folded her hands in her lap and was watching Nicholas with careful attention. Hartwick and D. Briggs were still. Hugo had not moved. Nicholas picked up the letter. This, he said, is a letter written to the local magistrate in January of 1815. 8 days after Cormac Doyle's death. It describes him as an employee under internal inquiry for theft. It recommends that no formal investigation be conducted. It states that he read directly the subject's minor child has been removed to a suitable situation and will require no further consideration. He set it down. It is signed by Hugo Crewe. The silence in the room changed quality. Briggs turned to look at Hugo. Hartwick's hands, flat on the table, pressed slightly downward. That I would like to note, Nicholas continued, that the employment contract I just read contains no mention of any inquiry. The estate accounts from that period, which I have also reviewed, contain no record of missing property. The journal entries my father made in January of 1815 do not record an inquiry. They record, in my father's own words, a feeling he could not account for, and the note that Crewe had handled the girl. He looked at the far end of the table. Crewe. Is there anything you would like to say at this point? Hugo looked at the letter on the table. He had the expression of a man looking at terrain he has crossed and finding that it has changed behind him. The fluency was still there. It would always be there, Nicholas suspected. It was too deeply habituated to be fully suppressed, but something had changed in the architecture of his composure. The letter was in his own hand. Nicholas had said so, had said he had compared it to the household accounts. And Hugo would know that this was not a claim that could be successfully challenged. The circumstances were difficult, Hugo said. A man died. There was a child. Decisions were made under pressure with limited options. The decision to describe him as a suspected thief, Nicholas said. In a letter to a magistrate, when no record of any such suspicion exists in any document he did not himself write. A pause. People remember things differently, Hugo said. His voice had lost some of its evenness. The decision, Nicholas continued, as though Hugo had not spoken. To describe his child as removed to a suitable situation and requiring no further consideration. As though she were an item of property that had been placed in storage. He paused. She is 20 years old. She has spent the last several years working in various households across Yorkshire. Not knowing her father's name or where he died. She arrived at Morden 3 weeks ago by chance. Because the posting did not name the estate that he looked at Maeve. She was standing by the door. She had not moved. She had not changed her expression. She was doing the thing she did, holding everything very still, allowing the room to be what it was. Not trying to manage it. Hugo followed Nicholas' gaze. He looked at Maeve, and Maeve looked back at him, and Nicholas watched the man at the far end of the table arrive at the understanding that had been coming for 8 years. She had grown up. She was here. You said she was nobody. Hugo said. It came out differently than he had intended, too direct, too unguarded, missing the careful management of his usual register. I beg your pardon. Nicholas said. That I said. Hugo stopped. He looked at the letter again, at the contract. At the 2 documents lying on the table between him and everything he had built on the foundation of what they concealed. He looked at Hartwick and Briggs, who were watching him with the particular expression of people who have known a man for years and have just been asked to revise their understanding of what they were looking at. He looked at Mrs. Renner, who had not changed her expression at all. Which was somehow worse. The fluency was gone. It was a difficult time, he said. The late Duke was there was concern for the estate's reputation. A foreign labor dying in unclear circumstances. A child with no family, these were not simple matters. I made decisions that I believed were in the estate's interest, that I in your interest, Nicholas said quietly. The room was very still. Hugo said nothing. Nicholas looked down at the two documents, then looked at the room. Hartwick. He said. Briggs. You have heard what I have read. I am asking you, as people with standing in this community, to bear witness to this record. I intend to place both documents with the estate solicitors, along with a full account of the circumstances of their discovery. And I intend to ensure that Cormac Doyle's employment record is formally corrected in the estate files. He paused. I also intend to ensure that his daughter is recognized formally as a member of this household. Not as a servant. As a person with a documented legal connection to this estate, Briggs said. That seems right. Hartwick nodded. Nicholas looked at Maeve. She was already moving away from the wall. She walked to the table, not quickly, not with any performance of arrival. Simply walked the length of the room with the same economy of motion she brought to everything, and she stopped beside Nicholas. She reached into the collar of her dress and drew out the bone whistle. Not from the apron pocket, where she usually kept it. From against her skin. Where she had put it before coming to this room. She placed it on the table beside the two documents. The bone was cream-colored and smooth and entirely unremarkable to look at. And it lay beside an employment contract and a letter from a man who had spent 8 years insisting her father had been nothing, and it was none of those things. His name was Cormac Doyle, she said. Her voice was low and unhurried. The voice of a person who has decided to use it carefully because it is worth something. He worked here. He was good at what he did. He made this. She did not look at Hugo. He made it for me because he said I would need it someday. To prove who I was. She looked at the whistle on the table. That I don't need it anymore, she said. I know who I am. The room was very quiet. Hugo looked at the whistle for a long moment. Then he looked at the table. Then he looked at nothing in particular, at the middle distance. At some interior reckoning that was his alone, that he said nothing. Nicholas looked at him. You'll leave Morden by the end of the week. He said. There is a cottage on the West Beholding that has been empty since spring. It is sufficient. You will make no further claims on this estate, and you will not represent yourself as formerly employed here in any capacity that requires a character reference from me. Because I will not provide one. He paused. The alternative is that I forward these documents to the magistrate's office and allow them to make what they will of the discrepancy between your 1815 letter and the employment record. I am giving you a choice because I am not interested in destruction for its own sake. But I will not pretend I do not have the choice to make. Hugo sat for another moment, then he stood that he did not look at Maeve. He walked to the door with the gait of a man who has decided that the best available form of dignity is efficiency, and he opened it. And he left. The door closed. Nobody spoke immediately. Then Briggs said, quietly, to no one in particular, I always thought there was something off about that man. That it was so precisely the thing that required no response that Aldrich almost laughed, and didn't. And the almost laugh was somehow the right thing, a small release of pressure, like a seam giving slightly in a garment that had been too tight. Maeve looked at the whistle on the table. She did not pick it up immediately. She let it sit there for another moment, in the open. Among the documents and the people and the lamplight, unconcerned with being seen. Then she picked it up and held it in her closed hand, and it was not hidden, and it was not a secret. And it was not a proof of anything. That it was just hers. Spring came to the moors in the way it always did in the north, not as an arrival but as a gradual reduction of opposition. The frost retreated by degrees. The gorse put out its yellow in patches, tentative at first. Then committed. The light changed quality, losing the flat grey compression of winter and acquiring something with more depth to it, more distance. On the high ground above Morden, you could stand in the middle of the day and feel, for the first time in months, that the sun was a presence rather than an absence. Maeve had been given Cormac's old cottage. It was a small stone building at the edge of the kennel grounds, 2 rooms. With a hearth that drew well and a window that faced east and caught the morning. It had been used for storage in the years since her father's death, and it had taken a week to clear it out: old feed sacks, broken equipment. The accumulated displacement of things that had nowhere better to be. She had done the clearing herself, not because she was asked to but because she needed to, because there was a difference between being given a room and taking possession of one. And the taking possession required the physical work of it. The handling of each thing and deciding where it went. She had found nothing of her father's. She had not expected to. Hugo had been thorough, but the stone was the same stone. The hearth was the same hearth. The window faced the same east. She worked in the kennels now under Aldridge's direction. With a formal appointment rather than an assignment, a documented position, a wage, her name in the estate's employment record with her father's name noted as previous holder of the equivalent position. Aldridge had shown her the entry himself. Setting the record book on the workbench and pointing to it with a bluntness that was, from him, a form of ceremony. She had looked at it for a long time. The hounds knew her completely by now. Even the newer ones, who had no reason to recognize anything about her, seemed to calibrate to her presence in the way that animals calibrated to consistent, unhurried attention. She spoke to them more than she spoke to people. She was working on this. Nicholas had given her space. This was not absence. She understood the distinction. He was present on the estate. In his patterns, occasionally visible on the moorland path in the mornings with thunder, but he had not pressed. He had not required anything from her. He had made it clear, through the quiet mechanism of not demanding, that whatever she needed to become in the months following the hall meeting was hers to negotiate at her own pace. She had thought about this more than she had expected to. She had spent a long time being managed, not always cruelly, sometimes simply pragmatically, as something to be placed and kept in place. She was not accustomed to space that was offered rather than taken. It was a warm afternoon in late April when he came to find her. She was at the high end of the kennel run, working with a young bitch who was being introduced to the tracking leads for the first time, a process that required patience and repetition and the willingness to let the animal make mistakes without consequences, to let it find its own relationship to the work. Maeve was sitting on the ground. Which was the best position for this, the position that said, I am not above you, I am not directing you, I am simply here. And the young dog was investigating the lead with the combination of suspicion and curiosity that meant the investigation was going well. She heard his footsteps on the path and knew them. He'll wait, he said. From the gate, she finished the session, brought it to a natural end rather than an interrupted one, because interrupted endings confused young dogs about what they were supposed to have learned, and stood, and brushed the dry grass from her skirt. And went to the gate that he had thunder with him. The old hound was moving more slowly these days. The winter had taken something from him that the spring had not fully returned, a quality of ease in his gait that had gradually diminished. He was still present, still himself. Still possessed of his comprehensive opinions about the world, but he was old, and the oldness had become visible. They walked north, as they had been doing since December. The path they had made was visible now, a slight depression in the moorland grass. The record of repeated passage. That I want to ask you something, Nicholas said. She waited that he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding on precision. She had learned to recognize this. The pause was not hesitation. It was the editing process of a man who meant what he said and therefore took care with saying my father's contract with your father, he said. The terms included the cottage and the position for as long as the estate stood. Cormac Doyle was a permanent appointment. He looked at the horizon. The west, where the light was beginning its afternoon change. I have spoken with the solicitors. The argument can be made, and it is not a weak argument, that those terms extend, in equity if not in strict law, to his immediate family. That you have a documented, legitimate claim to continued residence and a formal position at Morden. That he stopped walking. That I want to be clear, he said, turning to face her. I am not telling you this as the basis for what I'm about to ask. I'm telling you this because you should know it regardless of what you decide. You have standing here that does not depend on me or on my goodwill or on any decision I make. That standing existed before I knew you. And it will exist whether or not you want anything to do with me. A pause. I thought it was important to say that first. Maeve looked at him. He looked back. Nicholas was not a man who made himself easy to read. She had learned this thoroughly over the months. The way his face operated as a working surface rather than an expressive one, the way feeling moved through him like weather through stone, present but not performing itself. But there was something in his expression now that she recognized because she had seen it in one other place. In the face of a person watching an animal decide whether to trust that he was not managing the outcome that he was waiting. Why father made this estate his. He said. Not in law. In the way that a person makes a place theirs through the quality of their attention to it. Through caring how it works and knowing its rhythms and putting their hands into it every day. He glanced down at Thunder, who had sat down on the path with the decision of a dog who has gone far enough and is content to wait. I have been trying to do that. I am better at it than I was. I find. He stopped, and the pause was longer this time. The editing more deliberate. I find I am better at it when you are here. Not because of what you know or what you can do, though both of those things are a slight compressed movement at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile and was entirely itself considerable. But because of what it is to be in the same place as you. To walk the same ground. Maeve said nothing. That I am not offering you what you already have. He said. The cottage is yours. The position is yours. The standing is yours. I am asking something different. The level gaze. The careful voice. I am asking whether you would be willing to share more of this with me than you already do. Whether the life that is being built here. He made a slight gesture that encompassed the path, the moors. The distant shape of Morden below them is something you would want to build together. The wind moved east across the high ground, bending the new grass in slow waves. Maeve looked at the moors. She thought about the first night she had arrived at Morden, the cold flagstone under her bare foot. The bone whistle in her hand, the 6 years she had spent being placed and removed and placed again. The specific texture of a life lived in the margins of other people's arrangements. She thought about a name in a journal. Cormac Doyle. The careful handwriting. She thought about the morning she had first walked this path and found that she could walk it without counting her exits. She reached into the collar of her dress and drew out the bone whistle, not to use it. She held it in her closed hand at her side, the way she had held it on her first night, except that now the holding was not prevention but something else, not keeping it in, but keeping it close. The difference between a wall and a companion. She looked west, toward the light. Then she raised the whistle and blew one clear note across the moorland, from the path below, from further than seemed possible. From the edge of the kennel grounds where he had apparently wandered while they talked. Thunder lifted his head. His ears moved. He made no effort to come. He was old and the path was long and he had made his own assessment of the situation. But he heard it. He heard it, and he knew it. And he stayed where he was, because he was home. Maeve lowered the whistle. She looked at Nicholas. Yes, she said. He did not immediately speak. He looked at her with the expression she had been trying to find a word for since December. And she found it now. It was the expression of a man who has been holding something carefully for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. He reached out his hand. She took it. They stood on the high moors in the April light. And below them Morden sat in its valley like a thing that had been waiting to exhale, and Thunder, on the path below, lay down in the new grass and closed his eyes. Years later, Maeve would remember the summer Cormac learned to whistle, as the summer the kennels were noisy in a new way. He was 6 years old and deeply committed to the project, which he had undertaken with the same quality of focused, unhurried attention that he brought to everything, a trait his father identified as familiar and his mother recognized as coming from somewhere older than either of them. He practiced against the back wall of the kennel run, with his small face arranged in the expression of someone performing a technical operation, producing sounds that were enthusiastic and approximate and sometimes accidentally correct. The dogs found him interesting, not in the way they found most people interesting, the polite tolerance of animals that have been well trained into patience. They found him genuinely interesting. The way they found Maeve interesting, which was a different quality entirely. When he was in the kennel run they reoriented toward him. When he was not there they registered the absence in the particular way of animals that have formed an opinion. Maeve watched from the doorway. It was a late summer evening. The light long and level and golden, the kind of light that made everything look like a memory even while it was happening. Nicholas was somewhere behind her in the study, she thought, though she had heard him on the stairs a few minutes ago. And she had the sense without looking that he had come to stand behind her, that he too was watching from the doorway. Neither of them spoke. Cormac had found a spot near the far end of the run where a young dog the bitch Maeve had been training in the spring, 2 years ago now. Fully grown and serious in her work had settled in the afternoon shade. He crouched in front of her. He raised the small carved whistle to his lips. This one was new. Nicholas had commissioned it from the same man who had repaired the kennel equipment. A craftsman in the village who worked bone and wood and who had spent an afternoon with the original and produced something close to identical, child-sized. Pale and smooth, the original was on the shelf above the cottage hearth that it had been there for 3 years. It was not hidden. It did not need to be. It sat in the open where anyone who came into the cottage could see it, and most people did not ask about it, and the ones who asked were told. It belonged to my father, he made it. It was how he did his work, and that was the whole story, and it was enough. Cormac blew, the sound came out small and imprecise, the breath not yet shaped with enough control to hold the frequency steady. But something in the column of air that was learning its way toward the right form, that had the outline of what it would become when the mouth knew it the way a mouth learned things, below thought. Below intention, the young bitch lifted her head, she looked at the boy. She was not Thunder. Thunder had died the previous winter, in the cottage, on the rug in front of the fire, in the manner of old dogs that have decided they are finished. Which is the best available manner? She was not trained to this whistle, had no 80-year-old memory of a man in County Clare who had shaped the frequency for a specific animal's specific hearing, but she heard something, she heard the outline of something she didn't have a name for. That didn't require a name, that went to the place in an animal where recognition lived before language could reach it. She held still, she waited. Cormac blew again, longer this time, more controlled. The sound finding its center, the young bitch's ears moved. She held the boy's gaze with the grave, considering attention of a dog deciding what it thinks. Then she stood up, and walked the 3 steps across the run, and sat down in front of him. Cormac looked up at eye in the doorway. Maeve felt Nicholas' hand find her shoulder, briefly. The light pressure of a shared moment. She did not move. She stood in the long evening light and watched her son hold still, the absolute careful stillness of a child who has just understood that something important is happening and does not want to disturb it, and she watched the dog look at him. That particular quality of recognition, and she stayed quiet, she let it be. Her son's name was Cormac, the dog didn't know what that meant. The dog only knew that there was a sound, and that the sound meant something it trusted, and that the boy holding the small bone whistle was, in some way that required no explanation and would never need one, known.